And welcome. I'm Andy Mioch and you are watching A News. Let's have a look at the headlines. Donald Trump says U.S. will not use force to acquire Greenland. European lawmakers suspend U.S. trade deal amid Greenland tariff tensions. U.S. President invites more leaders to his Board of Peace for Gaza. Azerbaijan accepts the invitation. Thank you for tuning in. We begin in Davos, where U.S. President Donald Trump has ruled out the use of force to acquire Greenland. In a wide-ranging speech at the World Economic Forum lasting more than an hour, Trump said he is seeking immediate negotiations to acquire the Arctic island. This comes after he previously threatened to impose a 10% tariff on goods from 8 European countries that oppose his plan to take over the Danish territory.
I don't have to use force. I don't want to use force. I won't use force. All the United States is asking for is a place called Greenland, where we already had it as a trustee, but respectfully returned it back to Denmark not long ago after we defeated the Germans, the Japanese, the Italians, and others in World War II. We gave it back to them.
Let's now cross live to Davos and our Orhan Amashov, who is covering all the ins and outs of this year's World Economic Forum. Hi, Orhan. That was quite a speech by the U.S. president, wasn't it? What are your main takeaways?
I think, Andy, some of the statements, in fact, preponderant part of that very speech was a reiteration of President Donald Trump's earlier statements. But effectively, he reflected on the necessity of the United States assuming physical control over Greenland. Yes, indeed, he did mention that he would not use force or excessive force, but he did not rule out the application of constructive force of some sort. Basically, what he's saying is very sandy. He's saying that it's a no-brainer. He's saying that European countries are not in a position to take care of Greenland, and if there will be any danger emanating from China or Russia, it will be the United States who will come to the help of European countries. Well, President Donald Trump claimed that back in 1945, US effectively saved Greenland and gave it back to Denmark, and the United States back in 1945 saved Denmark itself. It was a speech characterized by economic triumphalism. In many ways, Europe is going to reflect and react. This process has not just happened overnight. This has been underway for some considerable time. And it's no longer the case of rupture. I think rupture is deepening, and rupture has been taken to a completely new level. President Donald Trump is effectively saying that the United States is the most important, the most consequential, economically powerful country around the world. European countries have been ungrateful, including Switzerland, France, and many others. And that US, by means of punitive tariff measures, is in a position to force anybody around the world to accept US point of view. This goes, Andy, against all we have known about international law. This is point number one. Yeah, basically, he's also, in relation to Ukraine, said that Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky would be very stupid not to end this war. I think it is very clear Ukraine is no longer perceived or understood as a United States, from America's own internal matter, or the matter in relation to which US wants to take any decisive measure. But what is very clear from all that we have heard, this particular forum, World Economic Forum, is about, its theme effectively was a spirit of dialogue, but there was nothing about this speech which was actually reflective of the necessity of having a dialogue. There was no surprise, but it's a very crucial moment, and I'm sure in the following days we'll be reflecting on it. Regarding the peace board and Azerbaijan accepting that particular offer, this is a very interesting moment. Many European countries feel very uncertain about this entire congregation called Peace Board, but tomorrow they will be meeting, and we all confidently expect that President Donald Trump meets some of the founding members, leaders of the founding members of this very board.
Orhan, there must have been a lot of reactions to Trump's speech and a lot of talk ahead of it. What is the sense you got from speaking to delegates there, and what was the atmosphere like in general?
Well, one of the key things which I've noticed would be the necessity of European countries doing something about it. I mean, we are in Switzerland, in Davos. This place exemplifies that global discourse of economic discussion. And all the countries here, European countries, will need to react. Let me give you one very particular example. President Donald Trump threatened France with a 200% tariff as part of a wider set of measures to be taken against 8 European countries, and those countries are to be subjected to 10% tariff. But the European countries will need to react together. You may punish one individual European country, but individual European countries are not in a position individually punishing United States. Any retaliatory measure should come from Brussels. And we all know there's a talk about $93 billion US worth of retaliatory measure, the trade bazooka, which is widely known as anti-coercion measure. European Union, since the installation of this measure, has never taken this particular anti-coercion measure against anybody. And United States is a key ally of European Union. So we have reached a level of political fragmentation and contestation when we're no longer talking about China and US trade contestation, but actually two power centers of Western civilization, United States and Europe, actually being at loggerheads. It's a very, very specific moment. And also symbolism of all that, I suppose, matters a great deal. We are here in Davos in Switzerland. This is a place which exemplifies that, or I mean, always meant to exemplify that liberal world order, international law, and so forth. But what President Donald Trump said today was a reiteration of his earlier statements, but was very clear: the United States from now on will be taking unilaterally punitive measures against its allies. And I'm not entirely sure after this point, Andy, there is such a thing as transatlantic alliance. Maybe we are reading too much into what Trump said. But knowing this person, the president of the most important country, knowing his actions regarding Venezuela, his actions regarding any or many other actors, there is a degree of seriousness, and it is very palpable. Again, allow me to reiterate what I said earlier. We're no longer talking about the rupture itself, its emergence. We're talking about proper, palpable erosion and its proper manifestation here in the very heart of what was once described as a cockpit of global economic discourse.
Well, not to be overshadowed by Trump's speech, this is a busy day at all the panels and sideline events over there. Can you walk us through the most significant ones?
Well, one of the key developments that have taken place here in the context of the region, Central Asia and the South Pole, would be probably the invitation that was extended to the leaders of Central Asian countries as founding members of the Peace Board. I think it's a very, very important moment. It's about effectively this governing institution in the fullness of time forming some form of alternative to UN-related structures. We're not talking about a replacement of the UN at this juncture, but since President Donald Trump has not shown any support for UN-led Middle East peace process, and since top-notch US officials has openly talked about United Nations being a criminal organization, I think that the credibility of the international institutions is in tatters. More specifically, as long as Azerbaijan is concerned, a number of meetings have taken place. President Aliyev himself met President of Israel. In the context of Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijani State Oil Fund, SOFAS, has entered a number of important, strategically vital relationships with the world's most important asset managing operations companies, and amongst them, of course, BlackRock and its subsidiary known as GIP, and $1.5 billion arrangement has been agreed upon. This is an ambitious plan, and naturally very similar, incredibly similar arrangement was agreed with another asset managing company today. Around $1.5 billion US dimension has been followed there as well. And tomorrow, very, very important day. The Peace Board meeting will be taking place, and everybody looking forward to that very meeting. And reflections on that very meeting will be very, very important. I think on the basis of what we have seen so far, Ukraine subject does no longer appear to be very central to global discourse. This is a reality. Volodymyr Zelensky is not here. This shows how, in the pecking order of consequential developments, Ukraine has lost its vitality. We are clearly observing the loss of strategic autonomy of Europe as a player. And all of the things, of course, will be reflected upon tomorrow as well.
Orhan, thank you so much for such detailed coverage, and of course, talk to you tomorrow.
Thank you, Andy. Talk to you tomorrow.
Sticking with Greenland, European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen condemned Donald Trump's threats of tariffs over the Arctic island. Addressing the European Parliament, von der Leyen said Greenland's future must be decided by its people, warning that coercive measures undermine sovereignty and international law.
The threat of additional tariffs for security reasons is simply wrong. We now live in a world defined by raw power, whether economic or military, technological or geopolitical. And while many of us may not like it, we must deal with the world as it is now. We are at a crossroads. Europe prefers dialogue and solutions, but we are fully prepared to act, if necessary, with unity, urgency and determination.
European lawmakers have put on hold their approval of the trade agreement reached between the European Union and the United States in light of Donald Trump's push to annex Greenland. Europeans are still weighing their options, from diplomacy to retaliation, ahead of the emergency summit on Thursday. William Denslow has more in Brussels.
Addressing members of the European Parliament, Antonio Costa, the European Council President, has had a sharp message in response to these threats by US President Donald Trump that it's prepared to slap tariffs on 8 European powers should Greenland, this semi-autonomous territory of Denmark, not be handed over to Washington. Antonio Costa, addressing MEPs, said that they will defend itself from any forms of coercion and that tariffs imposed by the US are incompatible with a trade deal that was brokered between the EU and US last year. Talking of that agreement, well, MEPs, members of the European Parliament, have decided to pause a decision to ratify that trade agreement on the basis of these ongoing tensions with Washington. Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, has also commented, describing the threat of tariffs as being a dangerous downward spiral. The EU has tools in its toolbox to hit back at the US with the potential of imposing tariffs of its own, as well as conceivably using the so-called trade bazooka, a never-before-used instrument that would see it have the ability to impose even more stringent penalties on the US, including export controls. That will be the major topic of discussion when European leaders convene here in Brussels for an emergency meeting on Thursday. Now, when it comes to trade activity, well, the EU has maintained that in this geopolitical context, the need to diversify its trade partners has become more pressing as ever. And recently they have signed a historic, what they describe as a historic trade agreement with Mercosur, a group of South American nations, to create what's seen as the largest free trade area. Now, it's been heralded as a win-win move, but there is huge opposition to this, and that was reflected in a vote on Wednesday that really saw Mercosur be sent to the top European courts to see if indeed this trade agreement complies with European law. Real questions now: what happens next? Can this deal indeed be implemented, or will it have to wait for the court to make a ruling on it? That is something that could take months, even over a year, to be deliberated upon. William Denslow, Free News, Brussels.
Over in Ukraine, a fresh Russian air assault has left more than 1 million people in the capital without power, hitting key substations linked to Ukraine's nuclear plants. Kyiv says the attack risks nuclear safety and is being used as a tool of pressure.
Ukrainians are having to continue to deal with freezing temperatures after a Russian airstrike on Tuesday left more than 1 million people in Kyiv without power. The attack also damaged substations that carry electricity from Ukraine's nuclear plants. Kyiv accused Moscow of using the risk of nuclear disaster as a tool of coercion. Ukrainian officials say Moscow used 330 drones and nearly 30 missiles, killing 4 people. 3 were in Zaporizhzhia and 1 in the Kyiv region. Other parts of eastern, southern and northern Ukraine were also hit. This was the second major strike on Ukraine's capital this month. Emergency crews are working around the clock to restore power and heating as temperatures drop to minus 13 degrees Celsius. President Volodymyr Zelensky said more than 4,000 buildings had no heating. Deputy Prime Minister Oleksiy Kuleba said 68 repair teams were working in the capital. More than 1,400 emergency heating centers have been opened for residents to warm up and charge phones. The International Atomic Energy Agency said several key substations were damaged. Power lines to other nuclear plants were also affected. Ukraine gets more than half of its electricity from nuclear energy. The agency added that the Chernobyl plant briefly lost all external power but was later reconnected. In the northern Chernihiv region, authorities said 87% of residents were left without electricity. Russia said it struck military, energy and transport targets. At the World Economic Forum in Davos this week, US and Russian envoys called talks on a possible peace deal positive and constructive. Zelensky urged Washington to increase pressure on Moscow, saying current measures were not enough. He said he would go to Davos if the US agreed to sign security guarantees and a post-war recovery plan. Ukrainian officials say in total, Russia has destroyed about 8.5 gigawatts of Ukraine's power capacity since late October.
After a short break, we will be laying bare the geopolitical tensions arising in Davos as Donald Trump's remarks on tariffs and Greenland spark sharp reactions from the Europeans. Do stay tuned. Welcome back. Now to unpack what we've heard from probably the most anticipated speech of this year's World Economic Forum in Davos, we're joined by political analyst Anna Evans, coming to us from Lisbon. Welcome, Anna. Great to have you on the program.
Thank you.
Let's start with Donald Trump saying the U.S. will not use force to acquire Greenland. Do you think Europeans will take his word on that as we wait for that emergency EU summit?
Well, Andy, I have always taken President Trump's words seriously, but not literally, as we usually put it in the analyst's realm. And the reason being that we know since the start of President Trump's mandate that one of the characteristics of President Trump's narrative is that the narrative starts a bit impulsively and strongly, demonstrating this belief that the US must be strong to keep ruling as the great world power. And so we are used to having President Trump start with a very assertive, wording, and then backtracking gradually, also under the influence of his advisors. So as analysts, it was expected that after the first impulsive statements, President Trump would listen to his advisors and fixers and communication experts and be less emphatic and take away the military option from the table, because of course this would be an unviable option, and the military advisors know that better than anyone. Any attack on a NATO member by the most important pillar of NATO, i.e. the US, would mean the end of NATO as we know it, and so this would be an unviable option. So as analysts, one expected that this would happen, that President Trump would gradually tone down and take away this option, the occupation, out of the table. But of course, he keeps keeps emphasizing that this is a serious geostrategic matter and that there will be consequences if the allies do not support his aims, with regard to Greenland.
Trump has called for an immediate start of negotiations to acquire the Arctic island, claiming quite a few times along the way that the U.S. returned Greenland to Denmark after the Second World War. Now, Trump was declined once before in 2019, and now he says that if the other side were to say no, the U.S. will remember it. What do you suppose he meant?
Well, this is another form of ultimatum. So basically, President Trump started with a very strong assertion: either you allow us to purchase Greenland, or we will military occupy it and resort to force. So this is the first kind of ultimatum. This is, I want this, either you comply with my will or I will invade. Now that he has toned down the military option, he needs, to portray force in diplomatic terms, which means, I will remember if you don't comply with my will, and remembering means I will, force economic penalties on you, i.e. tariffs, or, I will withdraw further from international organizations, or the US will also play, a lesser role within NATO. So basically what President Trump is saying, although I'm not considering the military option, I am still considering another set of options that will have either financial or economic or technological or security consequences for the allies. So basically this is what President Trump is doing. He's still trying to be maximalist in coercing his will to own, the geostrategic point that Greenland represents for the US, as well as for Russia and for Europe, and ultimately for China. Let's not forget that this is really a geostrategic major item. But he is, toning down the military side of it, but emphasizing, doubling down the economic, coercive, diplomatic side of pressure. So that's what this means.
Well, Trump devoted quite a significant part of the speech to say that the United States is subsidizing the world, fully bankrolling NATO. He told some tariff stories and so on. Now, with earlier speeches, mainly by the French president and Canada's prime minister in mind, how do you see Washington's major trade partners and allies reacting to the speech?
Well, Andy, we've seen a number of different strategies in terms of responding to President Trump's coercive diplomacy. So we see that in the case of the Canadian and French leaders, we always have these notions, Macron, does not deal well with President Trump's coercive tactics. He always portrays Europe as a continent that has a will to power, and the will to power has been incorporated now in the European Parliament's refusal to ratify, the trade agreement to the US. So Europe is saying, okay, we also have the power to implement consequences on trade. Furthermore, as we listened in a couple of minutes ago in your television pieces, Europe has also signed a very, very long negotiated agreement with Mercosur, and that agreement diversifies export and import partners for Europe. It has important trading consequences. So Europe is showing that it still has trade power, and President Macron has been defending, the implementation of the bazooka And the bazooka is basically a mechanism of trade punishment, if we can put it this way, that would, implement drastic measures on America's technology firms that operate a lot in Europe. So it would be a drastic trade punishment on services, and we know that the trade imbalance between the US and Europe is tilted to the US side on services because of the technological firms from the US. So, there are these numbers of either trade or other financial and services penalties that would not be so nice from the point of view of the US, and that President Macron has been emphasizing, and the European Parliament has implemented actually with the non-ratification of the Mercosur Treaty. And so this is a reaction, in the same way that in Canada, the Prime Minister has put it clearly that the country is kind of detaching from its previously aligned foreign policy vis-à-vis the US. And of course, Canada is a really important partner for the US as well. So basically, the allies are trying to show to the American administration that notwithstanding Europe's declining GDP in global terms and declining economic and technological and military force, because unfortunately that is the reality. Europe is not as flourishing in these fields as it used to be decades ago, but Europe is still trying to show that it still has mechanisms to respond and retaliate if President Trump, goes ahead with the economic coercion measures, namely the tariffs that he has been threatening.
Now, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, the US president said he would meet Volodymyr Zelensky, and that both the Ukrainian and Russian presidents want to make a deal. Russia's envoy is also set to meet the US team. Do you expect any significant progress on that this week?
Well, Andy, this is a very critical question, because analysts tend to portray, the current geopolitical noise about Greenland as a wiping out of Ukraine's issue, of wiping out of the table, of the negotiating table. But I must emphasize that one thing is the noise of the narratives and the noise of the arguments and the noise of what everybody is discussing. Another thing is the geopolitical strategy of the great powers. And so the geopolitical strategy does not change from 1 minute to the other. And so notwithstanding the fact that Ukraine is not as visible as it used to be, the fact is that the US is negotiating its interests in geopolitical terms vis-à-vis Russia and vis-à-vis China and vis-à-vis Iran. And we saw in Venezuela very recently that the US has a very clear mind and strategy and trajectory of foreign policy with regard to the non-aligned countries that give force to China, meaning Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and others. And so I would say that, negotiations with regard to Ukraine are obviously ongoing. They are out of the public radar, and these negotiations are always entangled with both Russian and US interests outside of Ukraine. So the Ukraine matter is also always inevitably entangled with other geopolitical interests of the great powers. And as we are discussing Greenland, other interests like China, Iran, Russia are very much, being kept at the negotiating table of the US. And the Davos meeting is a very nice arena, diplomatic arena, to join different leaders of the world and allow simultaneous conversations in parallel that will also facilitate negotiations about these key critical pillars of
Indeed,
geopolitics.
quite the platform. Anna, thank you so much for joining us and providing us with your insight.
Thank you.
Now, after a short break, we'll take a look at the major stories from the region. Welcome back. US President Donald Trump said he had a very good call with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on Tuesday. The Turkish presidency said they discussed Syria and Gaza. They also talked about fighting Islamic State and the situation of IS prisoners in Syrian jails. It's after Syria's government has taken control of parts of the northeast and ordered the Kurdish-led SDF to join the state. The U.S. said its partnership with the SDF has changed under the new Syrian government. However, Ankara sees the SDF as linked to the outlawed PKK and wants it to disarm. Erdogan said a stable Syria would boost regional stability. The leaders also discussed Gaza. Erdogan said Turkey would continue working with Washington for peace and thanked Trump for the Board of Peace invitation. Trump said the call was very important but gave no further details.
It'll be a point where
Azerbaijan has accepted an invitation to join Donald Trump's new Board of Peace. The U.S.-led initiative aimed at overseeing Gaza's reconstruction is drawing both support and criticism from world leaders.
Azerbaijan says it'll join and become a founding member of US Donald Trump's Board of Peace initiative for Gaza. Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev accepted Trump's invitation as a sign of the strong Azerbaijan-US partnership and recognition of the country's role in promoting regional and global peace and stability. The country now joins a growing group of nations, including Kazakhstan's President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, Morocco's King Mohammed VI, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have also confirmed participation. Other major powers, including Russia and China, have been invited. The Kremlin said President Vladimir Putin is still reviewing the proposal. France, however, has declined to join, prompting Trump to threaten high tariffs on French wine and champagne, a move Paris called unacceptable and ineffective. It was created to oversee the October 2025 ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war in the Strip and to manage Gaza's reconstruction. The initiative was endorsed by the UN Security Council last November and is set to be formally launched at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Under the plan, the board will oversee a transitional Palestinian administration in Gaza, support efforts to disarm Hamas, and deploy an international force to train a new Palestinian police force. Trump has called the board a key platform for long-term stability in the Strip and has suggested it could one day replace the United Nations, which he often criticizes as ineffective. The board's charter gives Trump veto power over all decisions and allows him to remain chairman indefinitely unless he resigns or is declared incapacitated by a unanimous vote. Trump says he has invited 58 world leaders to join the board as part of his broader 20-point plan to end the war in Gaza.
On the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Davos, the State Oil Fund of Azerbaijan has taken a new step with one of the world's largest real asset managers in a move expected to support long-term investment diversification and infrastructure development.
The State Oil Fund of Azerbaijan, SOFAZ, has signed a memorandum of understanding with Brookfield Asset Management to establish a long-term strategic partnership. The agreement was signed on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum and formalizes existing relations into a structured and expanded cooperation framework. Under the memorandum, the parties will explore up to $1.4 billion in investment and co-investment opportunities over the next 3 to 4 years, including potential direct investments in Azerbaijan. Priority sectors include financial and digital infrastructure, data centers, transport and logistics assets, energy transition and renewables, and real estate. The cooperation also provides for the creation of sector-specific working groups, joint site visits, and technical sessions to identify commercially viable projects. The partnership gives SOFAS access to Brookfield's global real asset management expertise, supporting more advanced and long-term investment strategies. For Azerbaijan, the cooperation is expected to support capital diversification and the development of sustainable infrastructure projects beyond the traditional energy sector. Brookfield Asset Management manages over $1 trillion in assets worldwide and operates across infrastructure, logistics, energy, and digital networks.
Oil production at one of the world's largest oil fields in Kazakhstan remains disrupted following a major infrastructure incident. Reuters is reporting that operations at the Tengiz field are expected to stay offline for several more days, raising concerns over exports and global oil markets. Our Fariza Kalimurzina has more.
Oil production at one of Kazakhstan's largest oil fields, Tengiz, is set to remain suspended for another 7 to 10 days. This is according to Reuters, citing sources familiar with the situation. The shutdown follows a major fire at a gas-fired power plant supplying the Tengiz oil field on January 18th. The blaze damaged key electricity systems, halting production at Tengiz and the neighboring Karalov oil field. Sources cited by Reuters say the halt could last at least until the end of the week and potentially into February. The agency also reports that 5 export shipments of CPC blend crude totaling between 600 and 700,000 tons have been cancelled for January and February loadings. Meanwhile, industry sources say the drop in output at Tengiz has not yet affected Kazakhstan's overall oil production. Crude output fell by 35% in the first 12 days of January compared to December levels, largely due to export constraints on the CPC pipeline. However, production has since rebounded at major Caspian fields, including Kashagan and Karachaganak. A-News requested comment from Tengizchevroil, the project operator. The company declined to confirm or deny the information and said it would provide updates as the situation develops. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A-News.
Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan said that the energy systems of Armenia and Azerbaijan will be integrated. Pashinyan added that both countries will be able to use export and import opportunities on equal terms. Pashinyan also described the trip route as primarily an investment project, noting that political issues are gradually taking a backseat while the investment aspect comes to the fore. He said the initiative is increasingly becoming an economic project. In the next few minutes, we'll be taking a look at the modern robotic technology in mine clearance operations in Azerbaijan.
Mine clearing machines produced in Azerbaijan by Improtex are showing how robotic technology supports demining work across the country. These systems, which have also been delivered to Ukraine, are designed to improve the safety and speed of mine clearance operations. Footage recorded under the framework of ANAMA presents the machines in real working conditions and showcases their technical strength and reliability. The advancements have also been featured at the UMEX 2026 exhibition in Abu Dhabi, which continues until Thursday and presents the latest in autonomous systems, robotics, artificial intelligence, and training simulation. Alongside the country's progress in robotics development, the threat posed by landmines in Azerbaijan continues. According to analysts, locally made robotic equipment plays a vital role in humanitarian demining and in supporting post-conflict recovery.
Turkey and Uzbekistan have taken a new step in deepening bilateral cooperation, holding their first 4+4 format meeting in Ankara. The talks brought together senior officials overseeing foreign affairs, defense, internal security, and intelligence. Our Adam Morrow has more.
Turkey and Uzbekistan have held their first ever 4+4 meeting in Ankara, bringing together senior officials from both countries responsible for foreign affairs, defense, the interior, and intelligence. The talks were attended by Turkey's foreign minister, defense minister, interior minister, and national intelligence chief, alongside their Uzbek counterparts, marking a new institutional format for high-level security and foreign policy coordination. Speaking ahead of Tuesday's meeting, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said relations between Turkey and Uzbekistan represent a strong partnership grounded in historical, cultural, and geostrategic ties. He noted the 4+4 format aims to further deepen those long-standing relations, adding that work in this direction was continuing. Fidan said the new mechanism allows both sides to discuss pressing regional and bilateral issues with what he described as maximum transparency. He also highlighted the strength of economic ties, saying bilateral trade relations are exceptionally good and praising joint efforts by the two countries for the benefit of the wider Turkic world. Analysts say the meeting reflects the rapid development of ties in recent years. Yashar Sareh, a professor at Istanbul's Ibn Khaldun University, told A News that relations have deepened significantly since Uzbek President Shavkat Mirziyoyev took office in 2016, especially in the fields of trade and defense cooperation. This is Adam Morrow for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
We're going for a short break now, and when we return, we will discuss the latest developments surrounding the protests in Iran. Do stay tuned. Welcome back. Now, joining us from Montreal to speak on the latest surrounding the situation in Iran is human rights activist and deputy director of the IPEC Research Center, Turkan Bozkurt. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, with severe communication restrictions still in place in Iran, what are you hearing on what's happening on the ground right now?
Hello again, and yes, that's correct. Iran has been experiencing an unusually severe disruption of internet access and digital communications, both in mobile and landlines. And this appears to be broader and more sustained than the previous experiences that we've seen in Iran. There are much indications of domestic connectivity that has been taking part these past few days, but these have been mostly in communication within the country. And while the internet access has been for almost 12-13 days now blocked, we're hearing that short amounts have been allowed to be used. Families are using these brief windows to share quick messages or short calls with their loved ones inside or outside of the countries, just to let them know that they're doing well. However, the scene on the ground seems to be a bit more horrific. Much of the protests seem to be stopped and government has it under control. However, the government is claiming that due to the foreign-backed armed terrorists that were involved, thousands have died, and the accounts for the number of deaths has been varying from 6,000 to 23,000 people, unfortunately. And the more troubling reports are concerning regarding the bodies of the deceased, where the government is asking for bullet price or bullet money to be paid to the government before they would release the bodies of the deceased. And the numbers for the price of these bodies are anywhere from 1,000 USD to 6,000 USD, depending on what city or area of Iran that you're talking about. And these numbers are incredibly high and expensive for the Iranian people who deal with rial. And unfortunately, at the time, due to the communications blackout, we're unable to have more communication and share more data regarding the number of people who have been killed or died. But according to the leader, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, they've been admitted that there have been thousands who are dead, and at least 25,000 as of January 19 have been detained.
Well, this is a difficult time for many in Iran, of course, but who do you see bearing the brunt of the unrest and the crackdown?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because when we talk about any issue in Iran, the Western media often forgets that Iran is a plural country. So 50% of Iran is made up of non-Persians. So there are national and ethnic minorities such as Azerbaijanis, Kurds, Baluchis, and Al-Ahwazis, who make up 50%, 46 million of the population. And based on previous protests, such as the Women Life Freedom protests that took place in 2022, but were much bigger than the protests that we've been seeing in the past couple of weeks. The fact-finding mission and many human rights organizations have released data showing that it is these marginalized ethnic and national minorities who are often the most repressed, who also have the most loved ones lost. So even though, as we mentioned, there is a big blackout right now, and we don't really know where these repressions have taken the most, we know that based on data from previous protests, that it is most likely that Azerbaijanis, Kurds, and Baluchis who would be targeted heavily compared to other parts. And even when we think about what we know already, such as that they're asking for thousands of dollars as bullet money for the people who have died. And when we think about from the perspective of these marginalized communities who are already severely impoverished and they experience, chronic unemployment and see much more financial difficulty compared to the central and metropolitan cities such as Tehran or Isfahan, it is most likely that, again, these marginalized communities will have the more difficult time and dealing with the protests and even getting the bodies of their loved ones. Like I mentioned, $1,000 USD is a lot. Some people don't even make that much money in a month or two.
Well, you've touched upon the previous waves of protests. Given those past experiences in Iran, what kind of options would you say there are currently for this situation to be resolved?
Yeah, it seems that even though there is a diverse amount of demands and voices about Iran and Iran's future, there is one thing that is consistent among many groups, is that the Islamic regime is not liked and tolerated, and a demand for its secession. So we don't know if this will happen or not, but based on this, I think there are a couple different scenarios of how we will proceed. So especially given the talks of Donald Trump, United States in general, and Israel and Western countries, there is a demand in general from the world that the United States wants to have a better relations with Iran, and that's not really possible currently with the Islamic regime. So in this scenario, the first, I think, option is that there would be a managed survival and a controlled transformation. So that means that the internal pressures from the people and the external pressures would lead to some sort of controlled transformation of the Islamic Republic to perhaps more democratic and more Western-friendly nation. Of course, another example is that there would be a regime collapse and the fragmentation of the country. This particularly if the IRGC and the military would be somehow targeted, could lead to the fragmentation of the entire country. And this is really important because when we think about the centralized power of the Islamic Republic and the previous government before them, during the Pahlavi era, the control and the power and resources have always been centralized, and the marginalized communities that I spoke about are really not looking for another centralized form of power. They're looking for a way to have control over their own communities and properties. So if the voices of these marginalized communities, the Azerbaijanis and the Kurds and the Baluchis, they're not heard, there's also the possibility that Iran could experience a prolonged low-intensity conflict. So similar to what we've seen in Syria would be an example. So the hopes are that whatever transition that takes place in Iran, if it does, would not be so prolonged that it would lead to some sort of civil war.
Turkan, thank you kindly for joining us and providing us with your insight.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. That's all we have for you for now. Stay tuned to A News.